and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland, where we are devoted to conversations of consequence that help democracy thrive. It's Wednesday, November 6th, and I'm Cynthia Connolly, Director of Programming at the City Club and moderator for today's forum. We are at the Happy Dog in Gordon Square for our Happy Dog Takes on Everything series. And tonight we are taking on the next president's foreign policy inbox. Earlier this afternoon, Vice President Kamala Harris conceded the election, and former president, now President-elect Donald Trump, will become the 47th president of the United States. Tonight, we will unpack what a second Trump term means for foreign policy and the world. Joining us to discuss what we can expect is Dr. Kathryn Lavelle, or Katie. She is the Ellen and Dixon Long Professor in World Affairs at Case Western Reserve University. And Milena Sterio, the James A. Thomas Distinguished Professor of Law and LLM Programs Director at Cleveland State University College of Law. Members and friends of the City Club, please join me in welcoming our guests today. So, did you learn of the results? Was it late last night or early this morning? Katie,
I need to say late last night.
You stayed up the whole time?
We made a deal not to look until this morning. I couldn't stand it. I looked last night.
You looked like, how about you? When did you find out the
I
results?
woke up around 5 o'clock and looked and saw that Trump had won.
Initial reactions to the results?
We're trying to stay neutral and impartial here. I wouldn't say that I was surprised by the outcome, but I was surprised by the margin of victory. I thought that the election would be much closer, and honestly, for this event tonight, I thought that we still wouldn't know who the new president would be. So I thought it would be much, much closer.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I would say that actually, even though you can debate about who won or who lost, I was actually glad to see that the winner took the Electoral College as well as the popular vote, because at least we can move forward and understand what happened in our democracy and what we're going to do going forward, as opposed to trying to worry about having one candidate who really had the will of the people and the other candidate who won the Electoral College. So at least we can focus on the goals ahead.
Right, and so, just for some context setting, take us back to 2016. It's Trump's first term. We're talking about his foreign policy inbox. What are some of the, remind us all of his foreign policy procedures, his perspective, his leadership style from 2016. Take us back there.
Yeah, I'm smiling because I was here at the Happy Dog. So we were saying I hadn't been here since then because of the pandemic. We'd done this online in between.
But yeah, our third presidential election, right?
I will say that it was more of a shock because, at least for those of us who are older, we have been through this before. The initial surprise, I think for those of us who lived through it in 2016, we saw it as a complete possibility from day one, as opposed to 2016, where people really weren't taking it seriously until the run up, and then election night was even worse. Seeing the complete turnaround in the results from what people had expected.
Go ahead. And I would say, the Trump policy from day one, starting in January 2017, has been one that his administration called America First, which is basically trade, tariffs, protectionism, but also isolationism, meaning hostility towards international law, international institutions, and also withdrawal from various international agreements. And I would predict that the new Trump administration is most likely going to act the same way starting in 2025.
So I know there's a couple really important issues that we are going to get to tonight. I think the first two are some of the most pressing. The war in Ukraine. I know that Trump ran on a platform where he said he would end the war both in Ukraine and Gaza in 24 hours. That was literally something he said on the campaign trail. What exactly do you think we're going to see out the gate first 100 days?
Well, there had been a lot of speculation about ending the war in Ukraine, I think, across the political spectrum. People thought there had been a diversity of views about whether or not Ukraine should settle. I think that the Ukrainians, at least the leadership, has appeared knowledgeable that this could be an outcome. And so there could be a settlement relatively quickly. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if the settlement was even before President Trump takes office again. And so we know that he's prone to hyperbole. So the whole 24 hours thing might be a bit overstated, but certainly with Ukraine, I think there will be a negotiated settlement, and there will also be an expectation that European countries are going to supply more of the weapons and more of the funding for that war, which means that it's highly probable that in the next 3 to 5 years, Europe will rearm itself. I don't know if I would say to a considerable degree, but there are certainly moves in Europe that the Europeans will be looking to rearm.
And I would just add, I don't disagree, and I would just add to that, if you start to unpack what the negotiation between Ukraine and Russia, brokered or sort of forced by Trump would look like, I think it would basically mean that Russia gets to keep most of the territory that it has acquired over the last 2.5 years, in exchange for some guarantee from Russia that it would not try to attack Ukraine again, not try to take more territory, and also in exchange for a promise that Ukraine would not join NATO. I think those are some of the negotiation terms that I think many predict. And so I agree with you, it's probably not going to be in 24 hours, but he has promised that he's going to start working on this even before he takes office in January.
So there's a recent development too over the last week, reports that North Korea has entered Ukraine to fight. Has that changed the approach? Has it changed the game?
Oh yeah, there's so much that's in flux right now, and I think that how troops perform when they're in the field has been an open question mark, even with respect to the Russian troops. So, what role these North Korean troops will play? Are they just more of I don't want to say a show, but are they there to show the outside world that Russia has support for this war? I think we can only speculate about that, but it's certainly concerning to see an alliance of any sort forming in the world community, and one where there is an active conflict brewing. I think that's concerning for anyone.
And I would agree that it's concerning, but I also agree with you that I don't think it changes things drastically. And I think when we start envisioning a negotiation where President-elect Trump basically, induces Ukrainians to go negotiate, I don't think that the presence of North Korean troops in Ukraine changes things drastically.
So when we talk about the Middle East, and specifically we're talking about Israel and Gaza, Netanyahu on social media today called this history's greatest comeback. Let's unpack that a little bit. Do you think that this is a benefit for Israel, a win for Israel, and will this end the war in Gaza?
Well, is it comeback for Netanyahu or comeback for Trump? I'm confused. Is he trying to claim that something there? I didn't see
all I saw on the post.
Yeah, I mean a comeback. Yeah, I mean there's no way that you can't look at this situation and say this is an incredible comeback, coming back from the legal problems, from the loss in the previous election, and also just kind of the sense of the former president's respect for our democratic institutions. So there certainly is a big comeback element there. A comeback for the Middle East, I think, with respect to Netanyahu, you have to remember that there are different conflicts. There's a conflict in Gaza. There's the broadening war in Lebanon that so many of us are worried about because of a broader the threat of a spread into Iran, into Yemen, into the countries in the region that would be very serious, and as bad as things have been, would be much more catastrophic. So I think that for Bibi Netanyahu, certainly I think he's been frustrated by some of the statements that the Biden administration has made, and he's probably happy to see this outcome. So he's gonna say something positive like that.
Although, I would add to that that Kamala Harris has actually lost a significant amount of Arab American votes in this election because of President Biden's support and sort of unconditional support. At least there's a perception of unconditional support for Israel over the last several years. Now, I don't think that the American foreign policy vis-a-vis Israel changes that drastically from a Democratic to a Republican administration. I think it's pretty much a policy of support. Now, it is true, though, that President Trump President-elect Trump, when he was president during his first term, was very friendly to Israel. Remember that he recognized Jerusalem as the official capital of Israel and relocated the American embassy to Jerusalem. Remember also that he basically brokered the so-called Abraham Accords between Israel and a number of Arab countries in exchange for American weapon support to these Arab countries. So he was very, very friendly and supportive to Netanyahu. And so I think that is obviously something that Netanyahu is reacting to now. I think the question we can ask ourselves is, what is he actually going to do? Is he going to actually try to broker some kind of a deal between Hamas and Netanyahu? Is he going to try to negotiate the release of the hostages? The question really is what he does next.
Yeah, and I know that we're going to talk about other, Mexico in particular in a minute here, but I do want to also touch on China, which is another global power. When he was running, he talked a lot about tariffs, right? And we're going to talk about Mexico too, because Mexico actually surpassed China, right, in tariffs recently. What are we expecting from China? I know there's a lot moving there, a lot of moving parts. There's some news that broke, a little bit ago, again, about Taiwan that hit the news today. So what are we expecting from China, particularly around tariffs?
Well, this is my analysis that people can agree with or not, but it seems to me that the Trump administration had a very complicated arrangement with China. On one hand, there was a lot of discussion of things that they were going to do and a lot of kind of saber rattling about China. But then behind the scenes, remember, he saved a Chinese corporation, and remember that he had made money. He had his daughter in business operations in China. And I think similarly, when we look at the situation you brought up with North Korea, we were saying, we all know that North Korea and China are allies. And so when we look at the broader geostrategic kind of chessboard, there's a lot of pieces and a lot of movement with respect to China that is still to be determined. It's an easy whipping post for politicians who want to appear to be standing up to some kind of a, particularly populist politicians who want to appear to be standing up to this foreign adversary and particularly defending American workers. But behind the scenes, with so many of the things that the former soon to be current president says, sometimes there's what's out front, and then there's what goes on behind the doors that can be dramatically different, and might explain some of the support that he has had in communities that we would otherwise question why they would support things like tariffs, because they would be aware that there are advantages to be gained, not in what the public perception is, but rather in the private perception.
And I would just, I agree, and I would just add that, so on the one hand, Trump, when he was president, had this policy of tariffs vis-a-vis China, export controls on things like computer chips and semiconductors, right? But on the other hand, I agree with you that the picture is a lot more complex. He also, by the way, talked about the human rights of the Uyghurs and talked about how badly they were being treated. But on the other hand, I do think that the situation is very, very complex. He has also, by the way, he gives himself a lot of credit and his claim that he has this ability to resolve all these world conflicts, including he has said that basically the U.S. doesn't need to really militarily do much more for Taiwan because he can, sort of whip China into compliance through the threat of more tariffs. Now, again, whether that's actually how things are going to unfold, we don't really know. And I think what's also interesting and important to add here is that I think China was watching Russia very closely. And I do think that the Chinese leadership was emboldened by the fact that Russia was able to attack Ukraine, take parts of Ukrainian territory. And now we're close to essentially a forced negotiation where Ukraine is likely going to lose bits of its territory. If Chinese leadership is watching this and going, well, you cut Taiwan, why not act, right?
Well, so that means Taiwan, that's like literally, there's talks about boots on the ground, of American troops and boots on the ground, potentially because of the disagreements between Taiwan and China. Do you want to dive into that a little bit more?
Yeah, though I don't think that we'll see boots on the ground. Though Trump is basically pre-isolationist. He gives himself credit for withdrawing the troops from Afghanistan. Although then he criticized Biden for the actual withdrawal. But he really kind of prides himself on not having boots on the ground, sort of not starting wars, and instead being able to broker deals. And he's very transactional. And so I don't think we'll see boots on the ground. China is a nuclear power. I don't think that, not just Trump, I don't think that Harris, had she been elected, I don't think that she would have put boots on the ground in Taiwan.
Yeah, I agree in the sense that the boots would have to be on the boats to get, if they're Chinese boots, they have to be on the boat. And anyone who looks at Taiwan understands that it's a pretty difficult island to invade. So we make a lot of comparisons to D-Day and crossing the English Channel. And I think that the geography and just the ocean, all of the elements that would have to come into play are very different in Taiwan. And interestingly, what I saw, one of the first things that he was attacking was this CHIPS agreement and CHIPS bill that would affect us here in Ohio. And I didn't know how that figured into Taiwan. So again, sometimes things kind of are at cross purposes and they don't make sense as a unified whole. Before we see who goes into the Trump administration to kind of sort these things out, I think it's very difficult for us to take things from the campaign and transfer them into what's actually going to happen in reality, because he has some pretty strong backers who have their own very strong interests in the economy, but also in the outcome of some of these geostrategic rivalries.
Yeah, you had mentioned transactional, and I wanted to dig in a little bit about, this new era, a returning era rather, of transactional diplomacy, and the way that Trump his style of leadership is very different than what we have seen. Do you want to dig into that a little bit? We talked about on the prep call. It was pretty interesting.
Yeah, so career diplomats, officials in the State Department, they're trained to conduct diplomacy as sort of a long-term affair, and the U.S. has these specific policies vis-a-vis countries and vis-a-vis leaders and vis-a-vis regions. And typically, traditional diplomacy is not transactional. It's long-term, and you're looking at conflicts in their broader context. You're looking at leaders and countries in a broader context. Trump, when he came into office, basically really dismantled most of that. And we did see from the State Department, not a huge number, but some officials who resigned in protest because basically they viewed the Trump administration approach to diplomacy as inconsistent with most of the training that they had received and most of the prior practices of U.S. style diplomacy. So the approach is to be transactional, to negotiate things on a sort of deal by deal basis. So for example, you're going to negotiate, Russia versus Ukraine without thinking of it more broadly, without trying to situate that in the context of the Baltics or Europe or NATO. You're going to negotiate an issue over Taiwan without taking North Korea into consideration, without taking other regional players into consideration. And so I do agree with you, though, what you said about it does remain to be seen as to who the next Secretary of State is going to be, what the leadership in the State Department looks like. And so I think it's hard to predict as of today as to exactly what's going to happen in the next 4 years. But I do think that President Trump, at least as a president, is going to continue to be transactional.
Well, and one thing I also think we know from before is that, any human being only has time for so many things in their day. And the analysis and the memoirs of people that have already come out from the previous administration would indicate that the president took an interest in a certain activity or a certain country or something that was going on, and then would rapidly shift and leave it to the experts and shift to another area. So when I try to think of why, why I would be less worried about the immediate situation in the world, I think that an awful lot of diplomacy is, like Milena pointed out, it's transaction, it's long term, and that frustrates people because citizens in a democracy look at that and they say, all we're doing is kicking that can down the road. We kick the can down the road. And, what I like to tell people is my father was in the Korean War. Yeah, we kicked the can down the road since the armistice agreement. But you know what? That means that my father lived a wonderful, full life. We have lived getting older, a pretty wonderful life. And hopefully our children and our grandchildren will. And even though that peace agreement wasn't perfect, because of good diplomats, we've been able to kick the can down the road and hopefully keep it in a peaceful situation. And so we certainly haven't liked the leadership of North Korea for all of those years, and none of this is perfect. But I think there's an element sometimes of, we've had this big move for democracy and getting people involved in foreign policy, which is awesome because we're here and we're doing it. But the problem with that could be that people want kind of solutions. They want to, let's resolve it. Let's invade Iraq and get it over with. And I think that there are people who might be able to put the brakes on some issues. Not all. We just won't know which ones going forward they prioritize. Some will probably be unpleasant for many of us who followed them for years, but some of them might actually stay on the back burner and might have a more positive outcome.
For another leadership style that Trump promoted in his first term is isolationism, right? America first. You had mentioned. When we look at our foreign policy agreements, like our actual legal agreements we have with other countries, the Iran nuclear agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, NATO. I'm looking at you, Milena, because this is kind of your jam. Take us down there. What should we expect with some of these agreements?
Yeah, so the America First foreign policy includes basically isolationism and withdrawal from international agreements. So Trump, when he was president the first time, withdrew. There was a negotiation at the time over the so-called Trans-Pacific Partnership, which would have been a free trade agreement involving various Pacific Rim countries. He withdrew the United States from that agreement, didn't think that was a good idea. He hated NAFTA, talked about withdrawing from NAFTA. He didn't withdraw the United States from NAFTA, but he basically renegotiated or sort of changed some of the terms of the NAFTA, also a free trade agreement. Obviously, he didn't really want it to be free trade. He wanted to be able to impose tariffs, particularly on Mexican goods, not so much Canadian, but Mexican goods. He also withdrew the United States from the Paris Agreement, the Paris Climate Agreement, and very importantly, he withdrew the United States from the Iran nuclear agreement, which had been an agreement signed between Iran, the United States, the European Union, and also other permanent members of the Security Council, so the UK, France, China, and Russia. And it was an agreement that basically included a lifting of sanctions against Iran, so an unfreezing of Iranian assets in exchange for Iran agreeing to a nuclear weapons inspection regime. That agreement, after President Trump withdrew the United States, basically collapsed. Now, President Trump, his foreign policy is to say that we need to be particularly tough on Iran, and he links Iran to the conflict in Gaza and Lebanon, and he thinks basically that by being tough on Iran, that means that Iran won't be able to support Hamas, and Hamas won't be attacking Israel. Now, whether that's actually how it works, I think many people would disagree, and I think many people would criticize this approach of withdrawing from international agreements and would argue that the United States actually benefits, and certainly benefits more in the longer term, if we participate in international agreements, if we participate in international organizations. So just to go back to the Iran nuclear agreement, and using that one as an example, had that agreement stayed in place, most experts believe that it would have disabled Iran from being able to actually develop nuclear weapons, at least for sort of 10, 15, 20 years. Where Iran is now, we don't really know. And so if the long-term goal is disabling Iran from developing or acquiring nuclear weapons, well, that long-term goal has now been completely, shot down by the Trump administration.
Yeah, I guess I would take a little bit of a longer view on isolationism in the United States, at least in American history. And I think most foreign policy analysis would look at this country and they would say that we've had these periods of isolationism, probably from our founding with the famous George Washington speech that, we should avoid foreign entanglements, take it all the way up to maybe even World War I, maybe this Spanish-American War, wherever they would start to put that in American history. But basically that we wanted to project our democratic ideals and all of our optimism and all of the wonderful example that we thought we could give to the world. And initially it was this idea that we would be an example ourselves, and then and other countries would then emulate us. That changed when the United States started to get more and more involved by actually sending troops and military involvement. Then the whole idea changed to, well, we're going to actually take our example, and we're going to really make sure that they get it. And I think that some of what we're seeing outside of this race has been a retrenchment of the American people and saying, wait a second. I guess where I take issue, not with what you said, but what we've heard from the Trump administration is this, we're for America first. Every country in the world is for itself first. The whole idea that somehow a country goes out there and puts another country ahead of itself is a little bit of a farce when you look at world history. Countries frequently align interests if they see a common interest with another country, but putting another country's needs ahead of their own would be political suicide. So I think what the United States has promoted, at least up until 9/11, was this idea that what's good for the United States is good for the world, that our ideals, that we can have this prosperity and peace, and we can have all of these things for everybody. After 9/11, obviously that changed because a lot of Americans, they got the message that people in other countries don't all agree with that. And so I think the isolationism there starts to kick in, 9/11, the Cold War ends. And this is before President Trump, when he was still doing TV shows and living at Mar-a-Lago and having issues with his wives. That was long before that the American people really were searching for a leader. So we saw it in the Republican Party, we saw it with Ross Perot, we saw it with some different leaders that really started to talk about the things that at least this morning we woke up and we had to confront because they've been there. They've been bubbling around. And we can talk all we want to about the president, but there's an awful lot of support in the American people for this idea that we should focus on our own first. And when we talk, before we tell another country what to do, we should fix our own, get our own house in order. So, I don't know that, this would be President Trump's exact language. I do think that as a people, we have to decide what it is we want to do and what kind of how do we want to promote ourselves and what do we want our example to be in the world, because maybe we don't want to give foreign aid, maybe we don't want to send weapons. I think with the Middle East, college students have certainly taught us that they are uncomfortable with the level of weapon supplies that we are sending to different factions in the Middle East. Fair enough. But then what example is it? Or are we just not going to set an example at all, which I think most of us are pretty uncomfortable with. And I would even extend that to people on both sides of the aisle and say that I think they would like to set some kind of a positive example on a better day. Maybe, I don't know about this morning, but I think on their better day, we would all share that goal as Americans.
You mentioned leadership and folks that people look to, and just to pivot just a little bit, in 2016, when we, had this kind of isolationist policy to our foreign affairs in the first Trump administration, the world looked to often European countries for leadership, right? As a beacon of democracy, as someone who's a protector of democracy. And that person was Angela Merkel. Who is that person now?
Well, I would go back, I just answer before you, insofar as I would go back to what I said. I think it's the American people have to be the people who are going to defend our democracy. We have to be the people who are going to participate. We have to participate in our local political institutions. We have to participate in our state institutions. And we can't be asleep at the switch and think that one leader is going to represent us, because we probably do the best job when we represent ourselves. I think most of us who've been overseas would find that one-on-one American individuals actually have pretty good relations one-on-one with most people.
But I mean, to the extent, I agree, but to the extent that we're looking for leaders elsewhere in the world, maybe in Europe or maybe somewhere else, that the United States can really sort of align itself with and look for a partnership, I don't think that's really crystal clear today, because even though, for example, Germany continues to play a dominant role in Europe, with Angela Merkel being gone, I don't think that the German leadership is sort of as strong today. You can think of the UK, well, with Brexit, that's not, that's not really happening. Italy has a far right leader, Giorgia Meloni, but she's not necessarily well perceived elsewhere in Europe. And so I don't think it's so clear that you can point to like one country and one leader and say, well, this is sort of another country, another leader that we, the United States or the Trump administration will align itself with. And I don't think that the Trump administration wants to. I think the Trump administration, I think President-elect Trump views himself as important enough. I think he thinks he can solve all of the world's problems in 24 hours. So I don't think he thinks that he needs any other partners necessarily.
Well, you mentioned partners, and not everyone in the world, I know there's some concerns around, NATO, the foreign policy agreements. Viktor Orban, for example, had, mentioned how excited he was about this. There seems to be some support for a second Trump administration across the world. Who are those nations, and what can we expect from their alliance with the U.S.?
No, I'm just laughing because I'm thinking good luck because sometimes the former to be future president has a little bit of a habit of changing his mind. So before I would settle in and take something to the bank, I would really want to see what's actually going to come out of that before I got too alarmed. I hadn't heard the Orban statement today, but I haven't. I was focused more on the American, on the Harris campaign and what their reaction had been. So I'm not surprised. You know, foreign leaders they're gonna send their statements in and whatnot. But he has had allies in his former administration who, let's say, were not supportive of his campaign. So I would tread lightly if I were the leadership in Hungary or some of these other countries that think they're going to get an easy deal.
So agreed, I don't think that they should necessarily count on anything, but I do think that his victory is certainly better perceived in Balkan states, sort of Central Eastern European states than in Western Europe. I think for example, in the Balkans, where there's really not a tradition of democracy, not certainly not since World War II, and there is a tradition of sort of dictatorships and autocratic leaders. I think there Trump is perceived as a strong man who can do lots of good things, and they're not really bothered by anti-democratic discourse. And so, as a general matter, I would say that he's better perceived in non-Western European nations.
We're gonna go to audience Q&A here in just a minute, but I do want to dig into Mexico. I know the president of Mexico had released a statement saying that she's looking forward to working with the Trump administration. And one of the things actually surprised me is what you said when we were talking earlier about immigration actually being a domestic policy, but the rise of kind of the populist movement, it becoming very much so a factor of foreign policy. How Trump promises to deport millions of undocumented immigrants. What do you think that looks like? Is that going to happen, and how is this going to impact our relationship with Mexico?
Yeah, well, the relationship with Mexico, I mean, as you point out, the Mexicans have their own domestic political problems, and so is the question really what we want to do with Mexico, or do we want the Mexicans to harden their southern border, which I think people would say had been the policy in some of the previous administrations to stop the migration patterns. I think, what we were talking about is so important to remember that these problems of immigration are deeply troubling for many advanced industrial democracies right now. Because when my ancestors came to Cleveland, or anyone else's ancestors came to this country, with the exception of people who came against their will, they came here and there wasn't a welfare system. So there wasn't the obligation that the government was taking on to provide certain things for citizens. Now we have pretty flimsy one here in this country, but in Europe it's certainly more extensive. So it becomes a different kind of of course there's racist elements, of course there's cultural elements, but there's also this element of just kind of who's going to pay for these people. And I think that many countries in Western Europe are dealing with that because they've had populist leaders come and try to blame people for problems that it's just easy politically to blame them for. And so, it's not something anyone, certainly if you're descended from immigrants, like so many of us are, you're not comfortable seeing this demonization of people from foreign countries. I always tell students, I'm the wrong one to come to for this because I teach international relations. I like people from other countries, or I wouldn't be doing this as a job. But there are some real considerations here that as a country, we and countries in Europe had to address, and we didn't perhaps take them as seriously as we needed to in terms of who and how are we going to help, which groups are we going to help in our own countries. And I learned that from teaching at Cleveland State. I came to Cleveland. I taught at Cleveland State, and if you know Cleveland State, people work a shift and then they come to school, or vice versa. And depending on where they come from, you either are so awed by their ability to work so hard, but by the same token, they're here and they're wondering why there's the perception that somebody else is getting help that they or their family couldn't get. And these are really troubling questions. We don't see it even as much at Case Western, because I'm not confronted day to day with the same type of student body. And I think it's really something to remind ourselves of how tough a lot of Americans have it right now in the current economy.
And I had mentioned earlier that Mexico actually has the most tariffs right now implemented on it.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
that's something that Trump, even as a candidate back in 2016, remember he railed against NAFTA. He thought NAFTA was like the worst thing ever. And so, just to, I know we're running out of time for the discussion. We're gonna leave time for Q&A from the audience, but immigration is obviously a hugely important issue. Trump, when he was president, did things like, remember, he started building the border wall. He had the return to Mexico policy where basically he forced asylum seekers to go back to Mexico and seek asylum, wait for their asylum to be processed in Mexico as opposed to doing that here in the United States. He had the family separation policy where the migrants, the refugees who were coming in were forcibly separated from their children. All of these measures were obviously intended to, sort of keep the border safe and reduce the number of people coming into the United States. So I do think that some of those policies will likely be resurrected starting in 2025. And so for Mexico, obviously, this changes things because many of the migrants coming in are not Mexican. They're coming from Honduras, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Salvador. And so many of them are just transiting through Mexico. So this policy, for example, of return to Mexico, it means that many of them are now staying in Mexico for a number of months, which means that the burden is on the Mexican government to somehow provide for them. And so I do think that the fact that he was elected will have an impact on Mexico for sure. I don't think the Mexicans are exactly rejoicing that he won.
All right, so we are about to begin the audience Q&A for our live stream audience. For those who's joining, I'm Cynthia Connolly, Director of Programming at the City Club. Joining me on stage is Dr. Kathryn Lavelle, the Ellen and Dixon Law Professor in World Affairs at Case Western, and Milena Sterio, the James A. Thomas Distinguished Professor of Law and LLM Programs Director at Cleveland State University College of Law. If you are here with us in person, you can line up next to the microphone on my left to ask your question. If you are joining us virtually or prefer to text in your question, you can text it to 330-541-5794, and our staff will try to work them in. A reminder to keep your questions short, to the point. Make sure it actually ends in a question mark for our panelists to answer, and so we can get to as many questions as possible. Can we get our first question?
You want me to say okay? Can I move this?
You got it. Yeah, you're right there. We can hear you.
No,
Oh, you're good.
I'm not. I'm trying to get closer to the microphone. Okay. Okay. The question I'm trying to ask is, I think Israel thinks if they kill the terrorists, they can stop the terrorists from taking hostages. So my question is, how can we stop terrorists from taking hostages?
I think there's a deeper question in there of how is the diplomacy going to work in the Trump administration? How is he going to promise that 24-hour end of the war with Netanyahu?
Well, so one of the, you mentioned that, was it a tweet from Netanyahu?
Yeah.
Basically, congratulating,
Yeah, history's greatest comeback, he said.
Right. So because of the Trump administration, the prior Trump administration, because of their tremendous support of Netanyahu, I think that Netanyahu now is probably hoping that President-elect Trump will come into office and will basically allow Netanyahu to sort of negotiate a deal with the Palestinians on basically any terms, that are good for Israel, right? That basically Netanyahu will be able to sort of say and do as he pleases, and that somehow, the hostages will release, but also maybe, Israel will be able to resettle Gaza, or, who knows what other things might happen. So I think that is what Netanyahu is certainly, hoping for. Now, to your question about how to prevent terrorism, I think that's a topic for a whole other panel. I personally believe that the best way to prevent terrorism is to engage in economic development. It's very easy to radicalize people when they have nothing to eat and where they live under horrible conditions, where they face oppression and discrimination every day. It's much more difficult to radicalize people if they have a decent standard of living. So I know that some would disagree with me, but I personally believe that economic development is the best way to prevent terrorism as a general matter.
Next question?
I
sorry,
was just
yeah,
gonna
go
answer
ahead.
the question a little bit in a different way. Thank you for the question. I guess I would look at comparable cases where countries have taken, or terrorists, or whatever faction you wanna call it, has taken terrorists or taken hostages and then try to extract. We know Russia's doing it right now. We know that in the past we had the Iran-Contra example. This isn't anything new. I think what has stopped it in the past, if I was just gonna pull an answer out of the air without thinking about it too much, I think I would say that mostly what it is that the underlying conflict has to get resolved. And here, we had been talking about a two-state solution with respect to the Palestinian situation. I think the situation with Hamas is very different than Hezbollah, and there might be a different kind of a solution there with respect to the Palestinian people. But until it's concerning that it will go on until there is some fundamental resolution of the underlying conflict. I think we've seen that in many other situations. It will be interesting though to see if Russia keeps it up once President Trump takes office, if they continue to take hostages, hostages. They don't call them hostages, but we'll say pull Americans in for questionable legal charges and then negotiate to release them.
Yes.
Well, thank you. A lot of people are very concerned right now, and I just wanted to make one brief observation that when a lot of us feel like we felt when Reagan was elected in 1980, but at that point, we initiated a revamped South African solidarity movement, sit-ins on Inauguration Day, mass protests, and within 10 years, South Africa was democratic. So it just goes to show that policy has changed. Now, here in Cleveland, we have a long history of peace activism. I'm a social worker, peace activist, retired from social work in Cleveland State, which I guess you both have had affiliations with. We here in Cleveland, Ambassador Mansour of Palestine has Cleveland roots. We have a very strong Ukrainian community here. And I'm trying to be optimistic about possible geopolitical solutions to international conflict. And I want to ask your views on a couple things, which I'm hoping we could somehow find a way to get people around the sandbox at the Cleveland State Engineering School and figure out these solutions. Take the Middle East conflict. People think that a two-state solution is not possible. What would happen if the king of Jordan would cede land on the east bank of the Jordan to make the Palestinian state more feasible, help solve his own refugee problem, and perhaps get a Nobel Prize out of it? Okay, that's the first solution I'm interested in. So take Ukraine, which I've been talking with members of the Ukrainian. It's real quick. What about giving Guantanamo-like control over the Ukrainian port to Ukraine as part of the settlement, short of giving them absolute control of all Crimea? Because we must do something, and I'm just interested in geographical miraculous solutions. Thank you.
So on the Middle East, let me start with that one. On the Middle East, I think your proposal would be unacceptable to Palestinians by and large, right? Because the Palestinians view themselves as having the right to live on the land where they live, be it in the West Bank or in Gaza. And so I don't discount your solution. I don't think it's a bad one, right? Because ultimately the conflict is territorial. Ultimately, both the Israelis and the Palestinians want to have sovereignty over the same territory,
Is this
right?
additional land in addition to the
Yeah.
West Bank and Gaza?
Sure, in addition, absolutely, but from a Palestinian perspective, they would tell you, why would we have to move? This is our land, this is not, it's like telling you, you're not gonna go live in Cincinnati, you're not gonna go live in Detroit, right? Nothing against those cities, right? But you're a Clevelander, you want to be here. And so from a geopolitical perspective, perhaps that's a good idea, but I don't think that it would really fly with the Palestinians themselves, So I think that's the difficulty. And to go back to this idea of the state solution, obviously most of you know here that has now become increasingly difficult to actually accomplish because there's so many settlements in the West Bank. And so all of those settlements would have to be dismantled. The Israeli settlers would have to move in order to create, an area, a territory where Palestinians could actually have sovereignty. And then on Ukraine, again, you're coming up with creative solutions. I don't think it's a bad idea, but I just don't think if we're going back to President-elect Trump, I don't think that's something that he has in mind. I think what he has in mind is basically saying, look, the reality is that Russia has captured, X percentage of Ukrainian territory. It is what it is. Too bad for you Ukrainians. We'll sort of help you a little bit. We'll support you. We'll extract some kind of a guarantee from Russia that they won't do it again anytime soon, but you lost. Right? Remember that he only likes the winners, right? Like he doesn't like the losers. So, I don't discount your solution. I think it's a good one, but I don't think that that's the approach that President-elect Trump would have.
Yeah, I guess what I would say is that, in foreign policy, we understand foreign policy to generally be very reactive. And so we could enter into a situation and we can say, here's our proposal. Certainly, I'm sure there's numerous proposals of what countries in the region. I mean, there's those of us who think that the proposed peace deal between Israel and Saudi Arabia was perhaps one of the provocations for October 7th. And so certainly outside actors can play a role, but there's an inherent peace building. And as you're familiar with the South African case, I'm sure you're aware that there was a vibrant and dynamic civil society in South Africa that made it possible to end that conflict and have a reasonably peaceful solution, because you had different groups, but they had formed doctors associations, professors associations, they had been allowed. That was not the situation in Iraq under the regime of Saddam Hussein. And I really don't see an analogous situation, because I see the Palestinian community in different situations, depending on where they are, depending on what their history is, and then of course the problem of people who left and have an international claim on returning. So I guess I would just always get back to this idea that it's very reactive, as much as any politician wants to get elected and say, I'm going to bring peace to the Middle East. We saw this movie before. Jared Kushner was going to do it, and perhaps they had good intentions. I can't judge that, but these situations are if they were easy to resolve, they would have been resolved a long time ago. So I'm not disparaging your solution at all. I'm just saying that I look at the other piece of it, and I don't always see parties that are willing to contribute to a good resolution, unfortunately.
It's a text question. Foreign policy depends on a Secretary of State to execute that foreign policy. Who's likely to become the next Secretary of State?
Elon Musk? No.
I don't think he wants that job.
But I do think that one of the problems with the Trump administration, we saw that back in 2016, and I think we're going to see it again, is that there are many experts in our respective fields